So another thing I predicted in my novel Behemoth is an ultimate nuclear war between Russia and Ukraine, and a United States retaliation or a NATO retaliation to Russian nuclear strikes on Ukraine, and that sort of finishes off the Ukraine war. Following the American retaliation to those Russian nuclear strikes on Ukraine, the Russian government falls apart. The Russian troops sabotage the nuclear arsenal of the Russian government, and the Russian leader is replaced by somebody else who seems a bit more responsible and is more in tune with the federalist cause, which is rising in the West. And this is roughly what kicks off the civil wars in Britain and the United States, and there's internal tension in all NATO countries since they believe that it's the start of a nuclear war. So, oh my God, the government's gone crazy. We're going to start taking power and so on. So there's mass uprisings in the United States, leading to several factions taking over different parts of the United States, leaving pretty much the United States government and military in control of only the eastern seaboard. In the United Kingdom, the king takes personal rule, along with Alistair Foyle, this maniac psychiatrist taking over Middlesbrough, and the British military fractures into a side which is loyal to the king, the so-called loyalists, and the federalists, who want to take over the country and unite it with continental Europe, forming a super-state called the European Federation, instead of what was formerly the European Union. And the ultimate resolution to the story is that, this is a spoiler by the way, so if you want to read the book at some time, there's plenty to enjoy in the book, but I am going to give away the endings. I think it's sort of important to mention in light of the recent intelligence report coming out of the United States about potential Russian aggression towards NATO within the next month or so. So yeah, I think this is worth mentioning, and it also serves as something of a solution to potentially wars in Europe and potentially wars between Russia and the West in the future. But yeah, the idea is roughly that the Federalists win the war. They ultimately develop a super weapon capable of destroying the swarm of drones, which is allowing the Loyalists to keep their territory in the United Kingdom. They defeat the king. The war in the United States is ultimately won by a union of all the rebel factions rising up against the United States military, and a peace is brokered after the war in the United Kingdom is won, and there's a sort of uneasy factional dispute for several years afterwards, whereby several regions want to become autonomous of the United States government and form themselves into their own distinct countries, but they do all sort of manage to harmonise things and engage in peaceful relations with one another ultimately. But however, what ultimately ends up happening is that Russia is included within that Western sphere of influence. So what it ends up doing is disestablishing the idea of Western power, in essence, and it creates a power shift whereby you end up with a huge superstate, more or less engirdling the entire planet. And this is something that's always intrigued me as a possibility, which is, why can Russia not join the European Union? And if there's ever going to be something like a European Federation, a European superstate, albeit with regional autonomy in given regions and not the disestablishment of any particular governments within Europe, but having the central governments of, say, Britain, France, Germany, whatever, being more like sort of regional centres of power, rather than the centres of power for given nation states, and they'd all be part of an ultimate superstate with its own centralised government, if you see what I mean. Then, in addition to this European Federation, is Northern Federation, this federation for the Northern Hemisphere, which would be an unbelievably powerful body, in my opinion, and allow us to have a far greater and more integrated degree of cooperation on all sorts of levels, and allow us to engage in far larger projects. And particularly at the end of my novel Behemoth, it sort of opens out into this rather hopeful future where a lot more space exploration and things like that are happening. And there's the flourishing of democracy in Russia and democratic institutions, and fair and reasonable law courts, and things like a Supreme Court, and separation of powers, and all these sorts of things that we have in Western democracies begin flourishing there. And it turns out to be as good for Russia as it is for the West. And the whole thing is sort of socialist, since all Western powers, including the United States, whether or not anyone wants to admit it or not, is also socialist. Do you see what I mean? Like, you have the public ownership of means of production, you have US mail, you have the public school system in the United States, you have the freeways, you have NASA, you have the public library, right? Like, that is the public ownership of the means of production. That is socialism. Socialism is for that sort of thing. You know, private individuals and companies and corporations, thankfully, are not allowed to own nuclear weapons, because some things must be owned by the government only, if you see what I mean. So, Americans have a big problem with socialism, and the USSR was the old enemy of the United States, and it was also really a bit pointless because they're both in it together, defeating the Nazis. Then they turned on one another. There's this Cold War for decades, and then the downfall of the Soviet Union. Then under Putin, everything got way worse, and Putin's response to the end of the Soviet Union was to start wars around the world. Ultimately, a very bloody and destructive conflict with Ukraine, which, in my opinion, has every chance, frankly, of going nuclear. I'm not sure it would actually. I mean, there's a chance it wouldn't, but it makes for a good story if it, playing with the possibility of whether or not it does. And in Behemoth, it does, and it sparks off civil wars in the West. Since the West retaliates, and then everybody's like, "What the flying fuck?" And we just nuked Russia. Oh my God, the world's going to end. We better take over the country, or we better rise up against the government and so on. And indeed, they do, and they exercise their Second Amendment rights. All the guys who've got AR-15s and so on, indeed, do take to the streets. Ultimately, American soldiers don't want to turn their machine guns on their own people, so they get pretty far with the conflict. Then they start fighting amongst themselves, and eventually that all settles down, and then there's a peace. And meanwhile, at the eastern seaboard, the remainders of the United States government are feeding supplies and people to the loyalists in Britain, and technology and so on, and making them very hard to defeat. So it's a really interesting book, I think, Behemoth. I think it's a really good, interesting political book, as well as being satire on many levels, and being funny, I think, in a very, very dark way. But I think it's worth reading, and it plays with a lot of interesting ideas. And I was just wondering if I said it too far in the future, that's all, because I said it in 2036, with the Civil War breaking out in 2034. So, I mean, maybe I got that wrong. Could actually be sooner than that. That's possible, maybe. But yeah, it's an interesting possibility. I would actually sponsor, Russia, one thing, joining the European Union, sorting out its status as a democracy, and agreements being forged to pump investment money into Russia to save these crumbling towns in Siberia, to sort out these horrifying drug problems with crocodile and so on, to raise up its living conditions, raise its GDP per capita, get industry going in Russia again somehow. But that would also have to come about off the back of an end to Vladimir Putin's regime, or to negotiate with him somehow, saying, we will help you fix your country if you join us. We'll create a huge super state, and it to be something like the Soviet Union, because it will indeed on a level be socialist. However, it will also be liberal and will allow a degree of controlled capitalism, which I think is a good enough sort of synthesis of the two ideologies, is it not? But whether he'd go for it or not, who knows, you know, and I think that's probably the best you could hope to put on the table. If he indeed really cares about his country, he would surely do that. He would take that deal. I'd take that deal if I were him. Damn good deal, that, I reckon. But yeah, like, the caveat would be obviously setting up the institutions associated with democracies. But yeah, a huge superstate encircling the globe. What we could not accomplish with something like that'd be really, really, really good, I think. A degree of regional autonomy, but ultimately, yeah, supranational control of the various nations orchestrated underneath it. Because like what the Russians are doing at the moment, like they're riding up far-right political parties in the West and riding up the masses with this nefarious swarm of bot accounts and gullible enough people doing it, you know, in their spare time, these keyboard warriors spouting bile on the internet, vile, inflammatory invective, just constantly trying to get rises out of people. And it's worked up to a point till now, you know, a lot of people have voted reform, but like, I don't know if it can continue. It's a headache thinking about what would happen if the likes of reform ever did take power. It's really worrying, you know, but it is what it is on a level. So that would be my solution to the Russo-Ukrainian war. I believe I've made a video about this before actually, but again, no one really watched it because no one listens to me. So, you know, Northern Federation of states, free movement of people between them all, obviously. So Russians can come live in the West, the Westerners can go live in Russia and work in Russia to their heart's content, and yeah, we can all work together on building a better future for humanity. I think it could be a great thing. But like, you know, if the anti-Russian sentiment is so deeply entrenched that we can't be the bigger party and do that for them, these people in, you know, who really aren't that different from us, who are suffering, I think that'd be shameful on us if we didn't.